Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, well, what a wild nomination meeting in Scarborough Southwest for the Ontario Liberals last weekend. We'll tell you about the guy who won by 19 votes and about the runner-up's allegations of improprieties.
We've seen the Ontario government take over school boards before, but a college? Yes, sir. Conestoga College has a lot to answer for as far as the Minister for Higher Education is concerned.
The Auditor General has a package of new reports out this week on everything from special education and trucker training to the use of AI in government. We'll get into her findings.
And in your column, my column, I'm going to talk a little more about that AI report from the Auditor General.
And because it's just such a good story with so much to say, I am focused on the Scarborough Southwest Liberal nomination meeting and some of the stuff that happened behind the scenes that you did not hear about unless you read my column.
It's Friday, May 15th, 2026, so let's get to it.
JMM, a little sugar for you. And can I just pay you kudos before we do the big reveal on what you're wearing?
Yes.
Some days, if you're a professional athlete, some days you got to play hurt, right? Yes. And John Michael is playing hurt this week. You are under the weather, but you are here.
Yes. It's been an off and on week, but I'm here and a public servant as ever.
Because you just didn't want to let me down, right?
Yes.
You didn't want.
Yes.
You knew that I'd be disappointed if you weren't here, so you are here, and I am grateful. That is a thing of beauty. Now. Yes. What are you wearing today anyway? What is that?
So this is one of many Godzilla-themed T-shirts that I have. This, I think, is the poster for Godzilla versus Gigan, which I believe was 1972, which has no direct relevance to topics of today.
To anything.
But you and I are both big fans of the various obscure traditions around Westminster parliaments.
Oh, yes.
And I learned about a new one, or at least a new one to me this week. So King Charles opened Parliament this week with a speech from the throne. And when the king delivers the speech in Westminster, there's all sorts of fun traditions. Did you know that a MP from the House of Commons gets held hostage?
No. This is a thing?
This is a tradition that dates back to Charles I, who had a famously tense relationship with Parliament. Mm-hmm. And when Charles would go to Parliament to deliver the speech from the throne, for example, he asked that an MP from the House of Commons would be held at Buckingham Palace to guarantee that the king would be allowed to leave Parliament safely.
And they still do it?
And now, of course, it's all ceremonial and symbolic. But yes, an MP from the House of Commons goes and spends the day at Buckingham Palace. I'm sure he gets a lovely lunch or whatever. And it's all there to symbolically guarantee that the king will be allowed to safely return after having delivered the speech to Parliament.
I did not know that.
If you want to watch a movie about battles with the crown, of course, there are many great movies about the histories of the 1600s. Or you could do what I do when I am feeling under the weather some days. I put on a Godzilla movie from the 1960s or 70s and watch that because, of course, Godzilla is king of the monsters.
That is a stretch, my friend. Well,
it was a long walk, but I got there.
It was a long walk, but you got there. And you know what? I can't be too critical because I'm about to do the same kind of stretching here. You ready?
All right, I'm ready.
Okay. You've heard of former Ontario Premier John Robarts.
Yes, indeed. Big
library at University of Toronto named after him. Do you know what his nickname was when he was the Premier?
Chairman of the board?
Correct.
Yes.
Do you know who I'm wearing today?
I do, in fact, recognize that face.
Okay, well, this guy had the same nickname. This guy, and I will stand up for those of you who are watching on television. There we go. That's Mr. Sinatra, whose nickname, of course, was the chairman of the board. Why have I got a Sinatra thing on today instead of a premier? Because, number one, I love Frank Sinatra. I actually saw him perform 3 times. Really? And he died 28 years ago yesterday. Okay. And I remember being on a shoot for TVO in Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Wow.
When he died, so I was out in the field doing a shoot and I did not get the news. And I called in to pick up my voicemails and I heard on my voicemail, Richard Azunian, former theater critic of the Toronto Star, was head of arts here at TVO for a long time. And his voicemail to me was, "Oh, Snake," my nickname, Pake the Snake. "Oh, Snake, I'm so sorry. I just heard about Mr. Sinatra and you must be just devastated." And that's how I found out. He broke the news to me and I just felt, oh my gosh, Frank Sinatra's dead. I mean, he was 82, so it had to happen. And John Michael, I haven't been the same since. It's Frank's world. We just live in it.
I appreciate you also working through this difficult time when you are still grieving.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I kind of am, actually. Yeah. I love to play his music still.
Yes.
Now, should we get to some just late-breaking Ontario stuff here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably the most noteworthy one for our audience is that we finally got the paperwork, the receipts. The government had been, I don't want to use the word harassed. They had been browbeaten by the opposition parties to prove that the government had in fact sold back the infamous now private jet that the premier had earlier purchased for his uses and the use of cabinet. Government had sworn up and down that they had sold the plane for as much as they had paid it for it, that there had been no net cost to the taxpayer. It turns out not quite. With the receipts that the government did in fact disclose this week, we learned that in the associated fees with the purchase of the plane amounted to about $190,000.
Legal fees, storage fees.
Yeah, they had started maintenance and storage contracts, those kinds of things. Those contracts then had to be canceled. And so, yes, even having never flown a single day in service, the plane racked up a substantial bill.
$190,000, we should, I guess, put this into some perspective.
Yes.
On a budget of $250 billion is nothing. Yes. But of course, it was the $16 glass of orange juice that got a federal cabinet minister eventually dropped from cabinet, because sometimes it's the little purchase, not the massive purchase, where people just shake their heads and say, how did that happen? And 190 grand might just do the trick this time. Who knows? Now, we should touch on the other thing is, and of course, the rumors about this had been swirling for the last week, but we got the official confirmation yesterday, I guess, that Honda is in fact canceling that $15 billion investment they had planned to make an hour north of the capital city in Alliston. And this, of course, will come as now confirmed devastating news to the auto assembly industry in the province of Ontario. And next week, a week from today, we will have Adam Chambers on the program. Yeah. He is the MP for the area. And I think there are some hard questions that we need to ask now about the advisability of continuing to try to subsidize the existence of an auto manufacturing and assembly industry in the province of Ontario, given everything these days. I'm not taking a position on it. I'm just saying, let's ask some questions.
Yeah, no, it's difficult not to ask those questions given both how rapidly the global industry is changing and obviously how much turmoil the North American market is in right now. So, I think a really important time to ask exactly those questions.
Now, let's just, before we go to issue one, let's do something pleasant, shall we?
Yes.
I had a wonderful conversation this past week with a woman named Mary Warner. Probably 2 weeks ago now. Mm-hmm. Mary's in her 90s, I believe. She gave what I can only characterize as an extraordinary donation to TVO, an extraordinarily generous donation.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary, indeed. Mary went to university with former Premier Bill Davis's first wife, Helen, who, if people have followed the story, it's a long time ago now, but who died very tragically of cancer when she was in her early 30s, leaving Mr. Davis with 4 children under the age of 7. He was very fortunate in as much as he had a second wife, Kathy Davis, to whom he was married for almost 60 years, and she was magnificent and saved his life and career and was a wonderful mother to his 4 kids. But anyway, I'm getting off the path here. Mary knew Helen. Mary said she is a regular viewer of On Poly. She described our show, John Michael, as somewhat off the wall. And she said, but you guys keep going. And I said, Mary, I'll keep going if you keep going. So there we go.
Very nice. We also got an email from Kate Goody. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly, Kate, who did write in to say, this is grand for any Ontarian to keep up with so many issues in Ontario today, tomorrow, and from our past. Your episodes are podcast gold and very relevant research for us commoners who cannot access all the data. Bravo to the heroes of TVO.
Wow.
Which was very nice.
It's podcast gold, Jerry. Yeah, it's gold, Jerry.
First time I've been called a hero, so I appreciate that.
All right. Lest we start to inhale too much here, let's get off to issue one. Well, it's not every day that a single nomination race in a single riding is one of the most compelling stories in provincial or even national politics. But We are arguably seeing that very thing happen this week in the riding of Scarborough Southwest in Toronto's East End. Nate Erskine-Smith, the MP for the riding of Beaches East York, wanted to be the Liberal candidate in the provincial by-election to replace NDP MPP Dolly Begum. But not so fast. Both the previous Liberal candidate and two others challenged Erskine-Smith, and when the votes were all counted, the winner was Ahsanul Hafiz by 19 votes out of more than 1,500 cast. Erskine-Smith has since alleged that the voting process was improper and has launched an official appeal. Here is some of what his team is alleging from his chief scrutineer, Andreas Katsouris.
There was an organized effort by Mr. Hafiz's campaign on Saturday to direct, monitor, and pressure people throughout the voting process. We saw many cases of people hanging around in the voting area, telling voters what they should do. Multiple people took calls on speakerphone or video so they could get instructions right in the voting booth. There were many cases of people taking pictures of their ballots on their cell phones. In most of the world, this would be considered clear evidence of vote buying.
So those are some serious allegations, and we did reach out to Mr. Hafiz's campaign for comment. They declined to comment, citing the arbitration process that is currently moving forward. Speaking of that process, the Liberal Party also announced late Thursday that the Internal Arbitration Committee would hear Erskine-Smith's case next week on Wednesday in Toronto. Now, all that aside, back to the actual events from Saturday. Unfortunately, while they were mere minutes away from my house, I was on the road on Saturday for family obligations. But fortunately, our Scarborough by-election senior correspondent was on duty, and I have him right here. So, Steve, what did you see on Saturday?
I'm the senior Liberal nomination by-election Scarborough Southwest correspondent?
Yes.
So who's the junior one? I haven't had the pleasure yet.
There's only two of us on camera.
All right. Look, JMM, I've been to lots of these things, right? Yeah. Over the years, I've been to lots of nomination meetings. Some of them are no news at all. Some of them are big time news, and this was one of those. It had its issues. I want to start with the moment I got there, and the organizers said to all the people who were already, there to vote, please line up over here, and the polls are not open for a half an hour, but you can start to line up if you like. And I thought, now that's very strange. Why would you do that, given that the four candidates who want these people's votes are about to speak. They're about to give their official speeches. Their names are going to be placed into nomination, and they're going to offer their speeches. Now, to be sure, most of the people who show up at these things already know who they're going to vote for on the first ballot. But of course, it's a ranked ballot, which means you can put first, second, third, and fourth choices down on the ballot. And I thought to myself, well, they may know who they want on the first ballot, but what if their candidate gets dropped off because they have the least number of votes? Then they need to know who their second and third place vote should go to. But the gymnasium was empty. It was at a high school in Scarborough. The gym was empty. Nobody was there to listen to the speeches. They were all starting to line up. So to me, an organizational mistake by allowing the lineup, and people didn't hear the speeches. And more than that, disrespectful to the candidates. These four candidates have worked their asses off for months. Sorry for the profanity, but it's true. They've worked their butts off. And the fact that the gymnasium was 95% empty and nobody heard their speeches was a real disservice to them. Yeah. Okay, that's number one. Number two, as the lineup was getting longer and longer, and a lot of people showed up to vote, 1,500 people, I believe, showed up to vote, you could see there were some people in line holding sample ballots. Yeah. And I must confess, I had not seen that before. And if you looked at the sample ballot, it would have the names of the four candidates and numbers beside, as in instructing you who to vote for on the first and the second. And okay, that's a little different, but presumably that was a campaign strategy undertaken by one of the campaigns in order to help people decide who to vote for. Yes. It's a little passing strange, but okay, probably nothing illegal about it, but it's a little passing strange. After the thing was over, John Fraser, the interim leader of the Liberals, said, process seemed pretty kosher to me. I think it's fine. If anybody's got any problems, let them prove it. Right. We then had the semi-bizarre situation of Nate Erskine-Smith losing by 19, which is pretty close, right? And, if you lose by 19 out of 1,500 votes, in a general election, you're probably entitled to a recount. Yeah. But this is a nomination meeting, and the rules seemed very what's the word we want to use? Happenstance?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are.
What's the old show? Whose line is it anyway? The rules are made up and the points don't matter.
I don't want to be that rough on it, but because of course there are very specific rules about how these things should happen.
Yeah.
But Nate Erskine-Smith kind of made a beeline for the exit after consoling his delegates, and eventually the reporters caught up to him, did a scrum in which he said there were things that happened in the counting room that his scrutineers had told him they had never seen before, and they'd done a lot of scrutineering. So he thought about it for a couple of days and then decided he's going to launch an official, protest, I guess, an official appeal to the count. Now, what happens at this stage, I guess, is what? Anybody's guess?
So what we do know is that, this is not something that he gets to appeal to court, right? This is appealed to the Liberal Party itself.
Yeah.
And they will judge basically whether they think there is sufficient evidence to overturn the results of that nomination meeting. And from everything I've read in the subsequent days, that almost never happens. There has been I think one successful appeal in decades.
Well, and beyond that, one of the things he was alleging in the parking lot in the rain outside after the whole thing was over was that the people who ran the nomination meeting are all kind of veteran behind the scenes liberals who don't like him. Yes. And his suggestion was they put their thumb on the scale for the other guy. Now, again, don't know this. It's an allegation, has to be tested, has to be investigated. But based on what I saw just myself on that day, it seems to me that there are certainly some stories that are worth investigating.
So one of the points that his chief scrutineer mentioned in particular that I do want to emphasize is bizarre is and he produced a photo, at least somewhat substantiating this allegation that people were taking photos and even videos of themselves marking their ballots and putting them in the ballot box. And there's a reason why that precise thing is illegal in provincial and federal elections, because that's what you do if you're buying votes.
You got to be able to prove to whoever you sold your vote to that you did it.
It's like people forget the history of the ancients here, but the reason we implemented the secret ballot, more than a century ago was to get rid of vote buying, right? So that is one thing that I think really does deserve special scrutiny. We are going to talk about this more in the your column, my column segment, but there are a handful of other issues that I want to sort of quickly mention here. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, waded into this race, gave a very sort of late endorsement of Nate.
Au contraire.
Well, he says it wasn't an endorsement.
He says it was not an endorsement, but it was a photo op. The two of them stood there.
A photo op where he said, "I hope you have a successful future in Scarborough," and they the Prime Minister can say what he likes. It was an endorsement. Everybody saw it was an endorsement. But it's really bad for the Prime Minister and most successful Liberal currently in Canada to make an endorsement like this and then for the endorsement to not work, right?
Never mind not working. He's got, if you think about the currency he's got right now in this country, to get involved in a provincial, not federal, in a provincial nominating meeting where he's putting his thumb on the scale for one of the candidates who ends up losing, not a good look.
No, it's bad. This whole, if I can engage in some cultural appropriation, this whole Michigas has raised this issue of whether we should more tightly regulate party nominations. This was obviously a big deal federally for several years running. It has now been raised provincially. I guess I will just sort of throw in that there's no real dispute about whether we can do this. This would be a matter of provincial jurisdiction. It's the kind of thing you might, at least in theory, see provincial parties get together and say, okay, the Wild West years were fun, but that time is over, and now it's time to buckle down and impose some serious regulations. We are not there yet. I don't see a ton of movement from. You would need to see the provincial government, the Ford government, come out and say, it's time for us to do this.
The reality is that political parties are kind of private organizations, and they can run their nomination meetings however they want to. I was talking to former Liberal MP Martha Hall-Findlay for this other little thing I do called the Paikin podcast, and I said, Martha, how would I describe, how would you characterize what goes on at these nomination meetings? And her answer was, rife with corruption.
Yeah. And then, obviously this brings us back to the question of the broader Ontario Liberal Party leadership race, right? Erskine-Smith's candidacy in Scarborough Southwest was supposed to be the stepping stone to his leadership bid to lead the Ontario Liberal Party. I mean, I don't see a path forward for him now.
Well, not so fast on that, I would say, because I did talk to him. I had a private moment with him before the results were announced.
Yeah.
And I say, do you have to win this nomination in order to go forward as a candidate for the Liberal leadership?
Yeah.
And he said, not necessarily. And this is before he knew any of the numbers. He said, if I get, if my clock gets cleaned, then yeah. But what if it's close? What if I lose a real close one? He says, not necessarily a fatal blow. Well, I'd say 19 votes, particularly when there were 34 unaccounted votes, right? The lists have got to match up.
Yeah.
The number of ballots you count has to be the same as the number of people who registered to vote.
Yeah.
And apparently there were 34 unaccounted for votes in a race that was decided by 19.
Yeah.
You got anything else on this, or should we move on?
No, let's move on.
Okay, off to issue 2. Provincial administration isn't just for school boards anymore. Conestoga College in Kitchener has had its entire board of directors sacked by the provincial government and a provincial director appointed by the post-secondary minister Nolan Quinn. The government alleges substantial irregularities in Conestoga's finances. JMM, what's going on here?
So I feel like every time we talk about post-secondary education, it all comes back to everybody dealing with the financial shock of changes to immigration policy, right? And Conestoga College was kind of like patient zero in Ontario. Of all of Ontario's colleges, Conestoga attracted the highest number of foreign students. That reached 32,500 foreign students by 2023-24 before federal immigration policy changed. And those numbers have, of course, fallen precipitously. The long-serving president of Conestoga, John Tibbetts, is widely seen as the person really behind Conestoga's growth strategy. And also the person whose compensation the government singled out in their news release announcing these changes at the board. They took specific aim at Tibbetts's both his compensation package and the severance agreement that the university signed with Tibbetts, which the government alleges exceeded provincial guidelines by quite some margin. So the board has been replaced by Linda Franklin, who will act as the provincial administrator and oversee the university's interim president, Norma MacDonald-Ewing. Franklin was previously the CEO of Colleges Ontario and is currently a member of the board for Niagara College.
She has a great deal of credibility in this sector. She's been involved in the sector for decades and decades, so a good choice, I would suggest, by the government in getting somebody in there who understands the plumbing and can probably get to the bottom of things. Just making the comparison, when we looked at what school boards were taken over by the province of Ontario, by the Minister of Education, some debate about why that one and not that one, or how did these guys get picked, or anyway, some controversy there. There's only one college so far that's been sort of selected for being taken over by the province.
Sample size of one.
Sample size of one, right. And do we have a sense about why this one? Because they're not the only post-secondary institution with lots of international students, obviously.
I think it's fair to say there's sort of two sides to this issue. On the one hand, it does genuinely seem to be the case that people within the post-secondary education sector, I mean, you laughed a little bit when I referred to this earlier, but people really did see Conestoga College as kind of a bad actor in the college space. And once again, that is not speculation on my part. One of these weird little, subplots to all of this, former Sioux College president, who was also former MPP, David Orazietti, singled out Tibbetts and Conestoga College in public remarks in February of 2024, saying that they were
so well.
Bad actors. Tibbetts responded by calling Orazietti, quote, a whore, and making allegations in turn about Sioux College and its student recruitment practices. Orazietti and Sioux College then responded by launching a defamation action against Tibbetts. I could not find any confirmation before we started recording about what the state of that lawsuit is, though I will say Orazietti has since resigned from Sioux College. And of course, Tibbetts is also resigned as president of Conestoga Conestoga.
Tibbets he's been a lightning rod in this sector for a long time. I mean, he and Orazietti had the most public flame war against one another. But if you talk to people behind the scenes, there were lots of comments about Mr. Tibbets and about what was going on at Conestoga. Yep. So there has been no shortage of criticism from what's going on at Conestoga, fair to say, right, over the last many years.
Yeah, and beyond the drama, the CW drama of it all, the numbers really do bear out that Conestoga massively expanded its student body with international recruitment, and that growth was not, as it turned out, sustainable, right? Conestoga, like other colleges and universities around Ontario right now, is dealing with serious financial difficulties. 2,700 positions were cut in 2024, and last year Conestoga announced 80 programs would be cut from their offerings. But to your point earlier, a lot of colleges and universities are going through financial distress, and if Conestoga was a particularly egregious case. I'm not saying that they were, but accept that for argument's sake at the moment. They're certainly not the only people in the sector who were profiting from international students. So it will be something to watch, right? Will other colleges get this same kind of treatment? And I will certainly be keeping an eye out to see if any further colleges get this kind of announcement.
Lots of layoffs there. What do the teaching unions or employee unions have to say about all this?
Right. So the Waterloo Record this week quoted Leopold Koff, who represents Conestoga faculty and librarians, who suggested that the province actually look at term limits for college presidents, because, of course, one of the issues here is that Tibbets had been president of Conestoga for decades, and I believe still has a building at Conestoga College named after him, and that was sort of one of the points of criticism here was whether it was unseemly for the college to name that building after him while he was still president. But Leopold Koff said, or he added rather, quote, whether it was a lack of oversight or a lack of interest, there's no escaping the fact that they, in this case he's referring to the provincial government, they allowed this to happen. And, that mirrored criticism that we saw from the opposition parties last week as well. And so I do think it is worth saying that as much as the board may have had a duty to provide oversight for things like these severance packages that they may legitimately have fallen down on based on what was disclosed in these audits. But some of this information should have been automatically flowing to the ministry and the minister and cabinet as well. And so it is fair to ask whether the government allowed this stuff to slide for longer than it should have and is now playing catch up.
Just by way of one little example here, people may be asking themselves, what could they have done that was so screwy? I think there was one example where there may have been an expenditure, for example, of $25,000 that somehow got listed as $126 million in the college's budget, and nobody caught it. Right. Like it seemed to just go through and go through and go through. And with that, let's go off to issue 3. The Auditor General has a fairly exalted place in the institution that is Queen's Park. She is appointed to a 10-year term to give her the kind of job security needed to be able to be critical of the government of the day. She answers to the whole legislature, not just the government. And she is nonpartisan, which seems to give her an extra credibility. So when Shelley Spence talks, people listen. What was she talking about this week?
So the Auditor General released 4 reports this week, and I'm going to start off by apologizing in a sense, saying we do not have time to get into each of these reports into depth that they deserve, but I strongly suspect that some of these will come up again in the future because that's the way Auditor General reports tend to go. So the 4 reports were about commercial truck driver licensing, special education services, the Family Responsibility Office, and this is the part of the government that enforces court orders for spousal and child support, and the use of AI services in the provincial government. So as is usual with these kinds of reports, the Auditor General found lots of things to criticize in these parts of the government. I do want to talk about the Family Responsibility Office for a second, because it has been the subject of prior audits and also an investigation by the Ombudsman of Ontario, who is, of course, a different officer of the legislature, has a different mandate, but these accountability officers will frequently cover some of the same territory. And it's been interesting to watch this department respond to scrutiny over the years. The auditor had a number of recommendations to improve its operations, and the FRO has accepted all but one on for a technical reason. But I do think it's a reminder for our audience, a useful one, just how many areas of people's lives, including ones that you probably don't think about very often, the provincial government touches, right? I could take 10 people off the street today, and I guarantee you not one of them, well, maybe one, could name the Family Responsibility Office. But it for the people whose lives it actually touches, it matters a great deal, right? We're talking about, collecting child support and spousal support, right? And aside from the fact that it's a very important job, it is necessarily also, unfortunately, it can be a very upsetting experience, obviously. So this report has some things to say. I just think the main thing I will say right now is, as I say, it's just a reminder of all the different areas of our lives that the province touches, and the auditor had some to say about that, and also, of course, many other topics.
Well, including special education. Let's go there. What did she have to say about that? Right.
So I will just give our usual disclosure whenever we discuss education policy, that TVO is, of course, an agency of the Ontario government and reports specifically to the Minister of Education. But we write our own material here. So about this audit, Ontario law requires that school boards provide special education supports to children that need them. The auditor looked at both the Ministry of Education as well as 3 specific school boards and conducted surveys of teachers to determine how well provincial law and policy are being followed across the province. The short answer, Spence found, is that there's a huge amount of inconsistency from school to school and from school board to school board. Teachers described a process that is hostile and opaque to many parents and too full of bureaucratic jargon just to get their kids the assistance and the services that they are entitled to. And in many areas, the province is not really collecting any kind of standardized data for the kind of apples to apples comparisons that you want to be able to make in these kinds of situations. Families face long and inconsistent wait times for supports. Staffing decisions by boards lead to inconsistent access. And, of course, these things have real effects in the classroom, and those effects are not just limited to students who need these supports, right? Kids who do not get the support that they need can often be disruptive. And that in turn leads to one of the auditor's other findings, that students with special needs are being, quote, informally excluded from schools in ways that are not being tracked by the government. Of course, the law does allow principals to exclude students if there's a fear of people's safety or whatever. But what she found is that in many cases, students are getting excluded from schools without the written policies being followed. The government did establish a draft policy in 2025 for exclusions, but that work was paused for the early election, you might recall.
I remember that.
And the work had not resumed by the time the auditor issued her report.
One more area, commercial trucking.
Yeah, this was an interesting one. To pull back for a second, right? Obviously, if you want to drive in Ontario on the King's highways, you need to get a driver's license. And if you want to drive a large commercial truck, that is a very specific type of license that you get. The standard G license will not do. So to get that commercial truck driver's license, you need special training that is overseen by the province, but is mostly delivered by private colleges. Some interesting distinction there. The auditor found kind of a mess in these career private colleges with some really basic forms of training being sometimes omitted and with data being falsified, which is particularly alarming. Some colleges did not train drivers on how to safely make a left turn, for example. That seems kind of basic to me. I think other drivers were not trained how to reverse safely, which again, seems kind of basic, kind of important. One detail here that she mentioned in the audit, there is a separate track of training institutions who are regulated not by the post-secondary education ministry that we were also referring to in our last item, but is in fact regulated by the Ministry of Transportation. And those institutions, regulated by MTO, did not show all of these same flaws and errors and omissions that she found in these private career colleges. So I'm not even sure exactly what the difference there is, except that I would say clearly MTO seems to be taking the job a bit more seriously.
Okay, should we do one more here? Artificial intelligence.
Yes, and so this is an interesting one because obviously a lot of people have very strong feelings about the rise of large language models and AI in general. For or against, whatever your feelings are, it is being adopted in a lot of white collar workplaces. And guess what? The government is kind of the biggest white collar workplace there is, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, we want to be careful about this stuff because the government also collects tons of sensitive information about people's lives. And the auditor wanted to know if the government had appropriate security policies and safeguards in place to ensure that people's confidential data doesn't get leaked into public AI models. Unfortunately, what she found was that, formally, the government does have rules about, for example, what AI models members of the Ontario Public Service are allowed to use. In practice, OPS workers are mostly using the same popular ones that people know about, right? ChatGPT, Claude, and these are ones that do not have the kind of secure environment that the auditor suggests is necessary. They are supposed to be using Microsoft Copilot, for the record, because that has a guaranteed security environment, I guess, but only 6% of recorded AI use on the OPS computers is going through Copilot. The other 94% are going through other models. So that's a problem. And the auditor recommends that the government simply block other unsecured AI models from OPS computers.
But I gather this goes beyond the Ontario Public Service, because I remember a couple of years ago, for example, doctors are allowed to use AI because, as we know, their handwriting is completely illegible. And if you can get a nice printout of whatever it is that they are telling patients, et cetera, that might be helpful. Is that happening here too?
Well, doctors are not just allowed. The government is encouraging them to use AI scribe systems that the government is procuring on behalf of like hospitals and other healthcare providers. And so the auditor looked at what kind of tests are being used in the procurement process to ensure that, so like the stuff we know that can happen with these large language models, right? So-called hallucinations, where the model simply kind of invents something almost out of whole cloth and makes a recommendation that is not based in actual evidence. That has happened with some of these models. Other models made transcription errors. Let me just back up a second. So what we're talking about here are scribe models that are supposed to help transcribe the doctor's notes, and it's sometimes they would transcribe even the interview with a patient. And I've certainly heard doctors say that these tools can be life-changing because they really do cut down on the amount of work that doctors have to do. But the Auditor General's question was, how safe and secure all these things are. So, we already talked about hallucinations. Some made simple transcription errors, and others omitted information entirely. And not every model did all three of those things, but not a single one of the models that was approved by the government for use in hospitals was totally free of errors. And maybe we don't need perfection. The point of these scribes is not to replace the doctor's judgment. It is still up to the doctor to confirm and if necessary, correct the results that come out of the AI scribe program. But I'm just going to reiterate that this is personal health information, right? And the consequence of getting somebody's prescription wrong, for example, could be quite serious indeed. We really do want to set a very high bar. The auditor's findings, I would not call them a total showstopper on the topic of AI in healthcare, but these findings certainly are worth taking seriously.
You got any more on AI you want to talk about?
I do, but I'm going to save it for the Your Column, My Column segment,
which I believe is coming up next. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I have a little chat about the stuff we wrote for TVO.org, the TVO website, over the past week. Okay, you've already hinted that you want to continue on about AI. What have you got?
Right. And so I did write about this earlier in the week, and specifically this issue of the use of AI in government. And I would urge people to just think as citizens about what we do and do not want the government to do with AI. You know, I'm long past the point of thinking that these systems are just, fancy autocomplete, as some people like to refer to them. There does seem to be a real power to these AI models that could genuinely be useful in government, right? Collecting, synthesizing, analyzing information is actually like a big part of just what we ask government to do. And insofar as AI can help do that more quickly and efficiently, and sometimes in ways that human minds just are not capable of, I think there's some interesting potential there. But we should also be very wary about the risks, right? And on the one hand, you could imagine, if we fed all of the information that the government already has about us into a system that could analyze it and slice up the data, and in theory, you could imagine, for example, a government AI agent being able to contact you and say, hey, there's this government benefit you didn't even know you were eligible for, but here we've already signed you up for it. Huh. So on the one hand, that would be like a positive vision of what AI could do in the future. On the other hand, that could just as easily be like a surveillance nightmare that I want no part of, right? And so, I don't think I've got like a truly firm, sharp answer on what I think AI should and should not be used for in public policy yet. But I would urge people to, if you are not already thinking about this stuff, think about it seriously and, apply the critical lens that we would ask any citizen to do on almost any topic.
There we go. I want to return to the Scarborough Southwest by-election.
Please.
Because while we did talk about it a lot earlier in the show, the fact of the matter is there's more to say. And it's an unusual nomination meeting because most nomination meetings, of course, when they're over, you focus on who won. The winner is the story. Well, that's not the case this time. Not that much ink has been spilled about the guy, Ahsanul Hafiz, who won this thing. So I'll just very briefly say the guy's he's quite an immigration success story, right? He came here from Bangladesh. He's, I guess, going to be, let's hold off. He wanted to become the first ever Bangladeshi member of parliament because he initially wanted the Scarborough Southwest federal Liberal nomination. But when Mark Carney and team pulled a bit of a fast one and managed to get the Ontario deputy NDP leader to sort of cross parties and go to the Liberals and become their candidate, and she won the by-election, Dolly Begum did, with 70% of the vote or something. Yeah. Very popular in that area, obviously. She became the first Bengali member of parliament. So he's trying now to become the second member of that community for the provincial parliament. He's got 30 Domino's pizza parlors that he's managed to purchase over the course of his business career. But he was not the story. The story is Nate Erskine-Smith, who's just one of the more intriguing politicians on the political scene in the country these days. And as you pointed out earlier, the idea was win the nomination in Scarborough Southwest, win the by-election. You're therefore in the Ontario legislature, a great place from which to run for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party, which is now vacant. Well, that plan is obviously shot now because not only is he not going to be the next Liberal MPP from Scarborough Southwest, he's also resigning his seat in the House of Commons this summer.
Yes.
So he will be, I guess, out of politics for the first time in 11 years since he became a member of Parliament. He still has options. He could still run for the Liberal leadership in November because, after all, Bonnie Crombie won it without a seat. Stephen Del Duca won it without a seat. Yeah. That is not unprecedented, so that is an option for him. He is a bit of a paradox, I have to say, in as much as the guy's obviously got game. Yes. I mean, he is a tremendous communicator. He's a bright guy. He's got ideas about what should happen with regard to housing, with regard to social services, serving the community. He's got a lot of ideas. He has a very loyal following. Yes. And to watch him, JMM, I got to tell you, after the nomination meeting was over and he lost that by a razor thin margin of defeat, some of his supporters were in tears. Yeah. And he went around person to person to person to person after it was over, smiling, hugging them, telling them to hang in there and everything's going to be fine. You know, I'm sure his own heart was breaking at the time, and yet he somehow managed to find the strength to make everybody else on his team feel okay, which is it's a talent.
Yeah. Now,
Mr. Erskine-Smith gets himself in trouble from time to time, too. He dropped by the media holding cell. Yeah. Cell, room. And sometimes you feel like you're a prisoner when they corral you all in there. Yeah. But he dropped by just before the votes were, the final tally was announced, just to shoot the breeze. You know, he's very comfortable in his own skin around people. And Laura Stone from the Globe and Mail very cleverly said, "Are you going to do a scrum regardless of how this thing turns out?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, of course." Yeah. Which was news to me because his PR person had already told me he's only scrumming if he wins.
Right.
If he loses, he's not. So she got a commitment from him on the record to scrum, talk to reporters one way or the other. Yeah. We all stood a discreet distance away from him as he was consoling his supporters. It felt like the right thing to do. Let's give him that time, 15, 20, 25 minutes to deal with his own team. And then all of a sudden, boom.
Tried to bolt.
He bolted for the exit. Yeah. A whole phalanx of people sort of crowded around him and out he went. And the weird thing about it was, it's pouring rain outside. Yeah. So the reporters, what do? We got to get the, we want to get the story. So we chase after him. And there we are outdoors in a parking lot, finally sort of surrounding him. He's not going to outrun all of us. And it's pouring rain. And we're doing this scrum, at which time he announces that he had seen all sorts, not he, but his team had seen all sorts of irregularities. And of course, that became the story. And he has now officially appealed the decision. Nate Erskine-Smith is turning 42 years old next month. He's a young guy. He's got, if he wants it, I suspect a longer political career ahead of him still. But he's got some decisions to make right now. One of which might be, and I'll tease this here because I'm going to write about this next week we'll talk about this again in a week's time. Brad Bradford is running for mayor of Toronto.
Yep.
Which means there's an open seat on Toronto City Council.
Yep.
And it happens to be the area of the city of Toronto that he represents,
yes.
Erskine-Smith, in Parliament. So there are people right now who are urging him to consider leaving all this Ontario politics stuff behind, try to get yourself elected at City Hall, and who knows what happens 4 years from now. Well, I mean, he has a chance to make a contribution at City Hall, and who knows what happens 4 years from now when whoever the next mayor is. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but suffice it to say, he has a lot of options to consider right now, and I'm sure he's doing just that.
I'm sure we will keep an eye out for that.
Right. Okay, let's go to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing from you. Our email address here is onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, hit us up. What do you got?
Right. So this week we have a letter from Tim Moffat in Lindsay, who writes, "Hi, Steve and JMM. I was just reading an article in the Kawartha Lakes Weekly paper about a local councillor and deputy mayor, Tracy Richardson, who chose not to seek re-election because of online abuse, social media trolling, and personal threats. I know she's not the first woman to be harassed for having the gall to pursue a public life, and she sadly won't be the last. It seems that in our modern era of partisanship and polarized algorithms, it becomes more and more likely that if you decide you want to be a politician, you have to accept the risk of a crazy person attacking you or your family. But why does it need to be this way?" That's Tim Moffat from Lindsay.
Well, I can tell you, Tim, and I'm not trying to be a smart aleck in making this comment, but if you want to talk about online abuse, social media trolling, and personal threats, I get them all the time. And I am, as they say, a white male of a certain age.
Yes.
So I know it's 10 times worse for women. It just is. I mean, we've heard from so many female politicians over the years. And we have also heard from numerous female politicians who just said, I've had enough of this and I'm out of here.
Yep.
So, yeah, this is a thing. This is a terrible, terrible reality of modern day politics in a digital age.
Yeah, I would say there's a few different parts of this topic that I want to touch on briefly here. The most prominent is, as we're talking about here, a real growing atmosphere of toxicity and a feeling of genuine threat that is facing local representatives. And I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want this to sound like I'm saying, people in rural communities are country bumpkins who don't have serious politics, because that's not what I mean at all. But we are seeing this increasing in areas of the province where the local politics have genuinely been less polarized. If I can put it, say, lower stakes, the election might be important. There might be certainly important local matters to address, but it doesn't take on necessarily this sort of the total citywide convulsive nature that sometimes elections here in Toronto do, if I could put it that way. And so this is a genuine change that I think we are seeing, right? This real nastiness in parts of the province where civic politics used to be just not quite so toxic. At least based on the reporting, like in this case from Kawartha Lakes, I genuinely don't know how else to put it except to say that some people are kind of losing their minds out there.
Well, here's the reality. If you're the mayor of a very small community in this province,
yes,
you are seeing them at the grocery store, you are seeing them at the gas station, you are seeing them, at a community event. You cannot not see your representatives. And as a result, I have heard from rural politicians that, you can't really hide behind staff. You can't hide in City Hall. You're out there in the community living your life with everybody else, and therefore trying to get away from the people who are going to be threatening to you is really difficult.
Yeah. And the other thing I do want to add before we wrap up is, something we've mentioned on the podcast before, that it is not just members of the public, of the broader public, that politicians have to worry about. Increasingly, we are also seeing disruptions on municipal councils coming from other members of those councils. I'm not going to rehash all of the various stories, but we've talked about them on the podcast before. And in part to deal with some of the, let's say, misbehavior of certain members of elected councils, the government introduced Bill 9, the Municipal Accountability Act, more than a year ago. In May 2025. They held consultations over the summer last year. Were told in no uncertain terms by multiple different groups of stakeholders that they felt the proposed law was too weak and it was unlikely to actually lead to changes in behavior. And the government proceeded to accept 0 consequential amendments at committee. And they have not, as of this recording, actually called Bill 9 for third reading. The Premier was asked about this week, and he said that he and the Minister of Municipal Affairs, Rob Flack, will see if they can get it across the finish line before the legislature rises for the summer. But I just find this a very frustrating case because, quite aside from the fact that Bill 9 is a weak piece of legislation that was very disappointing for lots of people in the municipal politics space, it is at least something, and the government has just totally dragged its heels on actually just passing the legislation, right? It has been out of committee since last October, I believe. It would have taken them very little effort, just objectively. There's lots of things I think I need to be careful about. I know how the legislature works. I know the mechanics of this. They could have called it for a third reading vote long before now. They have not done so. It's just such a clear case where they just have not made this a priority. And I thought I would take this opportunity to just shine a spotlight on that.
Yeah, this is a bill that is supposed to deal with the sadly too frequent occurrence of, say, one city councillor or town councillor verbally harassing or bullying or committing workplace harassment against others. And of course, it tends to be male on female. And this was supposed to provide for some penalties to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen. And from what you're saying to me, this sounds like it's not going to do a whole heck of a lot of much about that.
Well, it may not even be in effect until after the October elections. And I think one of the things that stakeholders were hoping was if the law had been in place before October, that might have changed the decisions for who was going to run in October. And now that's not going to be the case. So, the whole thing is, as I say, quite disappointing.
Why don't you give the email address and let's get out of here?
Absolutely. Once again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show, you can please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, May 15th, 2026.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Send us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. Stacey Dunseith is acting vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our wonderful studio crew. Guys, I hope you enjoy your Victoria Day weekend. You have earned it. And in the meantime, everybody, we say until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.